Welcome back, my friends, to Faces of History, the show where we strip off the dust of centuries, rip open the pages of forgotten footnotes, and stare into the eyes of the people who reshaped the world, even if the world tried to bury them. I'm your host, the Duke of New York, and tonight we're traveling back to a time when America was fighting for its soul. The year is 1782, the smell of gunpowder and revolution thick in the air. A new nation clawing its way out from under the British Empire. And somewhere in the middle of it all, marching under the name Robert Shirtliff, was a young woman named Deborah Sampson. She was not supposed to be there. The rules were clear. Women spun cloth, cooked stew, raised children, prayed for the safe return of their men. But Deborah Sampson didn't want to pray. She wanted to fight. So tonight, pour yourself a drink, settle in close, and let's meet the woman who went to war disguised as a man and carved her name into the bedrock of American freedom. Before she strapped on a uniform that wasn't meant for her, before she lifted a musket that no one thought she should touch, Deborah Sampson was just a girl. And in 18th century Massachusetts, that meant your life was stitched tight to rules you didn't write. Deborah was born on December 17th, 1760, in Plimpton, Massachusetts, the fifth of 7 children in a family clinging to the lower edge of the colonial middle class. Her father, Jonathan Sampson, claimed proud Pilgrim stock, even a line back to Miles Standish, one of the Mayflower's iron-willed soldiers. But that noble link didn't put food on the table. When Deborah was just 5, her father disappeared. The family story said he sailed off to sea, vanished with whispers of shipwreck, or maybe a new life with another woman up in Maine. Either way, he left Deborah's mother, Deborah Bradford Sampson, alone with 7 mouths to feed and no real means to do it. Poverty didn't just knock on the Sampson family door, it kicked it off its hinges. Colonial New England had no patience for single mothers with too many kids and no income. So, like many desperate women of her time, Deborah's mother did what she felt she had to. She sent her children away. One by one, the Sampson children were parceled out to live with relatives, family friends, or local farmers who needed extra hands. Little Deborah, red-haired, sturdy, taller than many boys her age, was sent to work as an indentured servant at just 10 years old. Imagine that, 10 years old. Not at school, not playing with dolls, not giggling behind a spinning wheel, but digging fields, milking cows before dawn, scrubbing floors until her back ached. For 10 long years, Deborah labored under a man named Jeremiah Thomas in Middleborough. She cooked, she cleaned, she learned how to handle a horse and mend a fence. She grew strong, stronger than some of the farmhands. And along the way, she learned something else, how to think for herself. Jeremiah Thomas, unlike many of his neighbors, valued books. Deborah officially wasn't meant to be educated, too costly, too unnecessary for a servant girl. But Thomas's sons went to the village school, and when chores were done and the candles flickered low, Deborah sneaked peeks at their primers and borrowed their spelling books. She taught herself to read and write by firelight. She read the Bible cover to cover. She read sermons, political pamphlets, travelogues, anything she could get her hands on. She devoured stories of the Israelites escaping slavery, Roman soldiers defending the Republic, Greek myths of heroes and heroines who defied the odds. By the time her indenture ended at 18, Deborah Sampson was no longer just a farmhand. She was a young woman with calloused hands, a curious mind, and an iron spine. She worked briefly as a weaver, a school teacher, a rare job for a woman and proof she was already pushing at the walls that boxed her in. But teaching village children how to spell freedom wasn't enough. Not when freedom itself was echoing from every meeting house and tavern across the colonies. The revolution was raging. The British still clung to New York City. Loyalists whispered in back rooms and militias gathered in candle-lit barns. It was a time when a bold heart could find purpose, if only that heart belonged to a man. The Duke of New York. So picture this, Deborah, alone at night in her boarding room, mending shirts for extra coin, her hands stained from work, her mind swirling with stories of Bunker Hill, of Valley Forge, of women boiling water to throw on redcoats, but never standing in line with a musket. That was off limits. But for Deborah Sampson, the rules were there to be rewritten. A girl who grew up scrubbing floors for someone else's bread, she knew hardship. She knew how to carry her own weight, and she knew that if she wanted a different life, she'd have to take it. Before she would call herself Robert Shirtliff, before she would stand under fire and dig bullets from her own flesh, Deborah was just a girl named Deborah, taught by life that the only freedom worth having is the freedom you carve out with your own two hands. In the next part of our story, we'll follow Deborah as she takes that wild idea that a woman could fight alongside men and turns it into reality, one stolen uniform at a time. Stay with me. So let's linger here a moment, my friends, because it's easy to say she dressed as a man and went to war. But the real question, the one they don't teach you in the dusty textbooks, is why? Why would a young woman, barely out of servitude, risk her life, her reputation, and the scorn of an entire society just to march, sleep in muddy boots, and bleed for a cause that barely saw her as human enough to vote, let alone fight? Well, you have to step inside her shoes, worn thin from years pacing the dirt floors of other people's homes. Deborah Sampson knew what it meant to be powerless, to have your life decided by the whims of men, the thickness of a purse, or the gossip of your neighbors. Her whole childhood was proof that the world wasn't fair, especially to a poor girl without a father's protection or a family fortune to hide behind. By the time the revolution roared across Massachusetts, Deborah was a young woman with more muscle than most farm boys and more fire than most preachers dared to stoke from their pulpits. She'd seen how this war, this grand idea of liberty, had cracked open the door just wide enough to tempt the bold and the desperate. When the Declaration of Independence thundered, "All men are created equal," Deborah heard something else, a promise not yet kept. If men could declare their freedom from a distant king, why couldn't she declare hers from the tiny prison of gender and poverty? The colonies were desperate for bodies. The Continental Army was starved for men, hungry for soldiers who could hold a line against British regulars and Hessian mercenaries. Boys too young to shave and men too old to march were drafted or volunteered. But not women. Never women. Deborah saw the contradiction plain as daylight. A nation fighting for freedom, while half its people, women, were chained to kitchens and cradles. She was no philosopher, but she understood hypocrisy when she saw it. She'd already tested the rules when she taught school as an unmarried woman, unheard of for her station. She'd spent her teenage years learning how to work alongside men, keep up with them, outlast them in the fields and barns. She knew she could fight. She could fight. The only question was, how far would she go? Money mattered too. Deborah needed it. Wages for a soldier were meager, but steadier than the odd jobs she scraped together as a teacher, a weaver, a maid. She was tired of begging for leftover pennies from people who thought a single woman should be grateful for scraps. Then there was the thrill. The quiet truth no one wrote down. Deborah Sampson wanted adventure. She wanted to see the country, stand under the same sky as Washington's men, taste life beyond the walls that said, "Stay home, girl." So she hatched a plan. Bind her chest tight, cut her hair short, study how the boys walked and talked. She took the name Robert Shirtliff, or sometimes spelled Shirtleff, a borrowed name with no family to track her down. In the spring of 1782, disguised in coarse linen trousers and a tricorn hat pulled low, Deborah Sampson, now Robert, stepped into a recruitment line in Bellingham, Massachusetts. Think about the courage that took. If she'd been discovered, the best she could expect was humiliation, stripped, flogged, sent home in disgrace. The worst? Prison. Or worse still, the life she'd always known. Powerless, anonymous, invisible. But Deborah Sampson wasn't built for invisibility. She was ready to risk everything for a taste of freedom most men took for granted the moment they were born. So when they asked her age, she lied. When they checked her teeth and shoulders, the crude checks of a time before real medical exams, she stood still, calm, chin high. When they handed her a musket and powder horn, she gripped them like birthrights. In that moment, Deborah Sampson crossed the line from servant girl to soldier. She didn't just break the rules, she rewrote them in gunpowder and sweat. In the next part, we follow Robert Shirtliff, Private Sampson, into the ranks of the Continental Army. The nights in muddy tents, the brutal marches, the wounds that nearly gave her secret away. So refill that glass, because the story of Deborah Sampson is just warming up, and this next chapter is forged in blood, loyalty, and a courage too big for any uniform to contain. Picture the ragged lines of the Continental Army in 1782. Worn boots, threadbare coats, half-empty bellies, but hearts full of defiance. That's the world Private Robert Shurtleff stepped into. The world Deborah Sampson stitched herself into with a needle of lies and a thread of raw nerve. Her regiment was the 4th Massachusetts Regiment of the Light Infantry, a company known for moving fast and hitting hard. This wasn't the rear guard, tending fires and counting beans. No, this was the spear point. Patrols, picket duty, raids behind British lines. And in those muddy boots and coarse trousers was a woman no one suspected. Robert Shurtleff drilled and marched and slept side by side with rough men from farmsteads, coastal towns, and city streets. She learned how to sleep on frozen ground, how to fire and clean her musket by moonlight, how to stand guard for hours with nothing but the sound of wind through the trees for company. They fought skirmishes, quick bursts of musket fire in the woods and pastures of upstate New York. They raided Loyalist farms and tangled with British patrols. Deborah proved fearless in the thick of it. She could handle a musket, swing a sword, and keep pace with the best of them. But the body has a way of betraying secrets. In the summer of 1782, near Tarrytown, New York, Deborah, as Robert, found herself caught in a gunfight with Loyalists. Musket balls cracked through the trees like snapping bones. She took a shot to the thigh, a wound that could have ended everything. Imagine this. You're 22, disguised as a man, bleeding into your breeches on a forest floor, terrified that if you let the surgeon see you, he won't just stitch you up. He'll unmask you and drag your name through the mud. So what does Deborah Sampson do? She crawls behind a tree, pulls out her own pocket knife, and digs the musket ball out herself. No anesthetic, no clean bandages, just grit and raw defiance. She patched herself up well enough to keep her secret, but not perfectly. Another musket ball stayed lodged inside her leg for the rest of her life, a hidden scar of how far she'd go to stay in the fight. As Robert Shurtleff, she rose in her comrades' eyes, a good shot, steady under fire, quick to volunteer for the worst duties. She was sent on scouting missions behind enemy lines, perfect for someone used to slipping through cracks and shadows, and all the while her disguise held. The other men chalked up her quiet ways to modesty. When she bathed, she kept to herself. When she changed clothes, she turned away. In a world where men were too busy surviving to question much, her secret stayed buried. In the winter of 1782, the war was winding down, but the skirmishes dragged on. Robert was stationed at West Point, the fortress on the Hudson where Benedict Arnold had once planned his betrayal. There she faced bitter cold, scant rations, and the endless boredom of waiting for peace to arrive. Disease stalked the encampments more than British musket fire, and that's what finally undid the mask. Deborah, Robert, fell ill with a fever. She collapsed unconscious, unable to protest when the regimental doctor Barnabas Binney examined her. He found the truth under the uniform. Instead of reporting her, Dr. Binney did something unexpected. He kept her secret, took her into his home to recover, and treated her with dignity when the Army had no protocol for a woman soldier caught out in the ranks. When she was well enough to stand, he quietly let her go. But the news couldn't be hidden forever. Word reached General John Patterson. Deborah Sampson, alias Robert Shurtleff, was honorably discharged from the Continental Army in October 1783. The war was all but won, the British defeated. The fighting spirit of a young woman had outlasted an empire, and she'd seen the battlefield she was never meant to stand on. She didn't get a hero's parade. She didn't even get her back pay right away. She went home with a borrowed suit of men's clothes and a discharge signed by the hand of the nation she'd bled to defend. But Deborah wasn't done rewriting the rules. Not yet. In the next part, we'll watch Deborah Sampson transform again, this time from a hidden soldier to a public symbol. She'd stand before crowds, tell her story, fight for the pay she was owed, and carve out a place for herself in the new republic she'd helped to build. So pour another glass because the war was just one battle. The fight for her legacy was still to come. Stay with me. Part 4, the public hero and the fight for recognition. So there she was, Deborah Sampson, back in civilian clothes, her borrowed uniform stuffed away in a trunk, her musket handed back to the armory. The war had ended, the Treaty of Paris inked and sealed, but for Deborah the battle was far from over. You see, the new United States of America was very good at waving flags and singing anthems about freedom, but paying its soldiers? Not so much. Even the male veterans of the Continental Army waited years for what they were owed. For Deborah Sampson, a woman who'd worn breeches and bled on the battlefield, forget it. She was invisible on the payroll ledgers. She went home to Massachusetts, to Plimpton, back to the life of a farm girl. But she carried her musket ball wounds like a quiet middle finger to the polite society that would rather pretend she'd never done what she did. Deborah married Benjamin Gannett, a farmer from Sharon, Massachusetts. She bore 3 children, spun her own thread, churned her own butter. To neighbors, she was just another housewife, kneeling in the garden rows, scrubbing floors, teaching her kids to read by candlelight. But she knew who she really was. She knew the piece of herself that had fired a musket under a false name, the piece that refused to vanish just because the war was done. So she started talking. Carefully at first, then boldly. She told her children bedtime stories about Private Robert Shirtliff. She wrote to old officers and petitioned the Massachusetts state legislature for the pay she never got. In 1792, nearly a decade after she left the Army, they granted her petition. Deborah Sampson Gannett became one of the first American women to ever receive a military pension for combat service, not as a widow, not as a dependent, but in her own right, as a veteran. She didn't stop there. America was still a country hungry for stories. Taverns, meeting halls, and town squares buzzed with talk of the Revolution and its larger-than-life heroes. Washington was gone. Hamilton was dead. But people craved the living echoes of that struggle. So Deborah did something no other woman had ever done in this young republic. She went on the road. In 1802, she launched a lecture tour, the first American woman to do it. Picture this: a mother in her 40s, traveling alone on horseback, stopping in towns from Boston to Providence to Albany. She'd stand before crowds of curious New Englanders, men, women, children, and tell her story. Then, and here's the kicker, she'd step behind a curtain, change into a soldier's uniform, grab a musket, and perform military drills on stage, loading, aiming, shouldering arms with the same precision she'd drilled under fire. She'd show the scars, share the truth, and dare the audience to question whether courage was only for men. Some came to gawk, scandalized by the idea of a woman in trousers. Some came to cheer, and all left with the uncomfortable truth that the revolution hadn't only been fought by powdered men in Congress or young farm boys with fife and drum. It was fought by the invisible, too. People like Deborah Sampson. In her speeches, she reminded people that the fight for liberty didn't stop when the guns fell silent. It had to be lived. And if a farm girl could pick up a musket and march under the name of Robert Shirtliff, what else might women do if given half a chance? Her lecture tour put food on the table when the farm barely did. She met politicians, petitioned Congress for more back pay, and won. With the help of Paul Revere, yes, that Paul Revere, who wrote a letter praising her service, Deborah secured an increase to her pension in 1805. She spent the rest of her life in Sharon, tending her children, spinning her legend in a time that wanted to forget it. She wrote letters, answered visitors, and guarded the truth that her courage belonged in the story of America's birth, whether America liked it or not. In the next part, we'll talk about how Deborah Sampson's story ends, how her name nearly vanished, and how generations later, we finally dragged it out of the footnotes and put it where it belongs, in the front lines of America's fight for freedom. So pour yourself a final glass, because we're about to close the curtain on a life that refused to stay hidden. Stay with me. So what happens to a woman like Deborah Sampson when the musket is hung up, the crowds go home, and the country she fought for moves on to new battles, new heroes, new sins to atone for? She went home to Sharon, Massachusetts, back to her husband Benjamin and their children, back to farm life, to chickens and churns and rocky soil that barely gave back what you put in. The crowds forgot her, the newspapers forgot her, but Deborah never forgot herself. She carried those old war wounds to the end, the musket ball fragments still lodged in her thigh, the scars that never fully healed. Like so many veterans, she wore her past not as a medal but as a reminder that freedom always asks for more than it promises. As she got older, life got harder. Money was always tight. Farming was brutal work, and Benjamin was no rich man. Deborah took in sewing, worked odd jobs, and every year made her slow, careful trip to petition for her pension, that thin lifeline between hunger and hope. When she died in 1827, at 66 years old, she was buried quietly on her farm in Sharon. No hero's funeral, no soldier's salute. Just a plain stone in the earth for a woman who'd once fooled an entire army and fought for a country that nearly forgot her. Her grave lay quiet for decades. Generations passed. Her story slipped from memory or stayed buried in the footnotes of local town records. Robert Shurtleff became a rumor, a ghost story, a trivia answer, if anyone bothered to ask the question at all. But history has a way of circling back. In the late 1800s, women's suffrage movements began to dig up the stories buried in dusty attics and old pension files. Deborah's name reappeared, now as a rallying cry. A woman who disguised herself to fight for freedom. What better symbol for women for the right to vote, to serve, to stand equal under the law? Her great-great-granddaughter, Clara Barton, yes, that Clara Barton, founder of the American Red Cross, proudly told people about Deborah's legacy. Writers and historians dusted off her pension petitions, her lecture flyers, her discharge papers signed by John Patterson himself, and slowly the pieces came back together. Today, Deborah Sampson has a statue in Sharon, a plaque at her grave, books written in her honor. The Massachusetts State House has a flag that bears her name, the only woman to fight and win a full pension as a revolutionary soldier in her own name, not as someone's widow. She even became the official state heroine of Massachusetts in 1983, a small but fitting salute to the farm girl who dressed as a farm boy, grabbed a musket and sunlight, and stepped into the storm. So who was Deborah Sampson? A patriot? A rebel? A trickster who bent the rules and made a country see what a woman could do when the door was bolted shut? She was all of it. And like all true revolutionaries, she left us a question, not an answer. What rules are you willing to break when freedom is on the line? Thank you for marching through time with me tonight on Faces of History. I'm the Duke of New York. If Deborah's story lit a fire under you, subscribe, share it, and leave a review so more people know these hidden corners of history. Stay brave, stay defiant, and remember, the uniform doesn't make the soldier, the fight does. Good night.